Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us in the world today. And welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. In realist research, few concepts are as foundational as CMO configurations: context, mechanism, and outcomes. These three elements lie at the heart of how realist approaches explain change, helping us unpack not just what works, but how, why, and for whom. In real world settings that are often messy and complex. But understanding CMOs and specifically using them well takes more than just reading definitions. In practice, developing a strong CMO configuration involves interpretation, iteration, and often a lot of uncertainty. Do you start with theory or data? How do you know you've got the mechanism right? What happens when context shifts? In today's conversation, we're diving into exactly those kinds of questions, exploring how CMOs are built, where people often go wrong, and what it really means to make this core realist tool work in practice. Whether you're new to realist or looking to sharpen your thinking, this episode will offer insights, clarity, and real world examples. And who also joined me in this conversation but Andrew Harding. Andy, hello, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Alejandro. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this really interesting subject.
No worries at all, Andy. Thanks to you, because I know that you've been doing realist work for a long time, and I'm sure you've built a lot of CMOs in your time and gone through all these different questions as well of what they were in the first place to building and trying different things. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about that. Would you mind just quickly introducing yourself and the work that you're doing so far with the realist approach?
Yeah, thank you. Um, I'm a lecturer in health inequalities in the Division of Health Research at Lancaster University. My realist journey first began, I think, probably around 10 years ago or so when I first went to Justin's Cares summer school. At that time, I was doing my own PhD. um, that followed a realist approach. And, in some of the less so in some of the research jobs that I took after that PhD, but certainly transitioning to a lecturer role, I've tried to keep involved in as much realist research as I can to the point now where on our sort of blended learning PhD program, I'm often the one matched up with students who choose to do a realist approach for their PhD. So I've gone from student to supervisor, I suppose, in the last decade or so. Yeah.
Thanks, Sandy, including myself as well, which is exciting. And I think that it's that you bring a fantastic lens in there because you've kind of you've been wearing both hats at some point as a student, struggling with those conversations, but also then now as a supervisor helping students in the realist journey, which is fantastic. And I guess you say it started 10 years ago. 10 years ago, 2015, we just had 2 years before that the first Ramsey's standards for realist synthesis come across. The realist evaluation ones in 2016 hadn't come across just yet. So you had this element of CMO configurations. You would have read it in the past, particularly from 1997, Paulson and Tilley. And obviously, you've done a lot of work with these. But being such a core part of realist research, sometimes individuals, when they're starting with realist work and realist approaches, can find them tricky to grasp at first. So, just to get us started, to get us warmed up, in your own words, what does a CMO actually mean? This context mechanism outcome configuration, and why are they so central to understanding how change happens in complex settings?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. So, in my mind, a CMO configuration is essentially a tool, that we use as a way of unpacking how and why an intervention works or doesn't work, for whom and in what circumstances, as the famous tagline goes. So, it links the context, so the conditions or circumstances that relate to the broader rationale of the intervention, if you like. It links that to mechanisms, so the processes or responses triggered by the intervention. And of course, the outcome, which is trying to capture what change happens as a result. And it's this triad and configuration that's central to realist work because it allows us to explore generative causation, which is what it's all about, of course, which is a key tenet of realist philosophy. And this tool helps us move beyond simply focusing and asking, does this intervention work? So what is it about this intervention that works? In what conditions and why?
Thanks, Andy. And I think one of the key things that you say there, which is one of the things that I enjoy the most, certainly around the definition and when we're explaining CMOs, is that it's a way of thinking. and that it's not a mathematical formula that it must always be followed at some point. There's been developments of CMO. People have added, for example, ICMO, so intervention and actors, or split the mechanism into. All it does is helps you to think beyond the surface, is let's say. And in previous episodes, we've mentioned around going at the bottom of the iceberg, right, to understand what is going on and for whom, how, and in what context. So thank you for sharing that, a really clear example into what CMOs are. And you have what a CMO is. That's a great starting point when you're developing this configuration. Where do you usually start? Because people may be asking, okay, that's fine, I can do that, but what do you start with, data, with theory, with a bit of both? Or what does the process actually look like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think in practice, it's a mix of both. You might often start with a theory, even if it's an implicit one. That theory might come from existing literature, practitioner experience, program documents, or even stakeholder assumptions, or even the expertise within the research team itself. And then we use data to test, refine, and even refute those ideas. And it's an iterative process where theory, data, and the researcher are almost in a constant and iterative dialogue with one another. You might begin with a rough theory, but through engaging with the data, you refine your understanding of the mechanisms at play and the conditions under which they're triggered.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I like as well that mention that you say around the iterative nature. So again, it's not a linear process of getting into these CMOs. There will be certain elements and certain areas that you have to follow to get this thinking really, really deep in that process in time. You've been a student, Andy. Now you're a supervisor. You've worked 10 years, in the realist approach. So I'm sure that from your own work, your own experiences, and seeing others do the same thing, you have probably seen some misunderstandings or some mistakes or some assumptions that people make from CMOs that are not necessarily what they should be from a realist term in that way. So are there any common traps or misconceptions that you see students or even realist researchers come along when it comes to CMO configuration, either building or understanding?
Yeah, a couple spring to mind. So I think a common oversimplification is to equate mechanism with the things that go on in the program activity, when actually mechanisms are a combination of that and the reasoning and responses that the interventions trigger in people. So not just aspects of the intervention itself. But when we only focus on sort of aspects of the intervention, if you like, we don't really fully get to grips with how generative causation happens and why, because there's no human reasoning component. So we always think that's very helpful to keep in mind. And it makes things very surface level. And I suppose relating to that as well is that sometimes when a human response is a more explicit part of a mechanism, let's say, sometimes it can still be very superficial and lack depth. And I think Justin's iceberg metaphor is perfect for highlighting this. So, a mechanism is not necessarily what's visible on the surface, and we need to avoid fairly descriptive or surface level mechanisms and think about them with a level of depth. So, scratching underneath the surface to get to unpick that kind of latent phenomena that drives responses and reasoning. And I think actually this is where kind of confidence and thinking like a realist comes in. So having that confidence to analyze the data and go beyond what's reported in a transcript of an interview, let's say, and really use your own expertise. And this is where retroductive reasoning comes in to kind of help come up with those, I suppose, convincing explanations about what's really driving the causal process that you're looking at. And I think it's being and knowing that this isn't a simple and straightforward type of analysis. As realist researchers, we have a license to think creatively about these kind of latent aspects that drive causal activity. It's not as straightforward as coding what you see in a transcript, like you would say in a thematic analysis, although that might be part of the process. But it often involves lots of memo writing, testing things out, getting messy with your data. I think from my experience, some of these processes can't be forced. Something really useful and transformative in your analysis that gives you that level of depth might come from when you're, having a coffee or going for a walk, or so, always have a notepad to hand, I suppose is some advice I'd give. And, you never know when that light bulb gets switched on.
I love that, Andy. That process that you're talking about there at the end, that being method neutral, that anything can be useful to get those hunches and those ideas. That reminds me actually of the paper Porson, Wong, and other colleagues did on a radio program when they were looking around the smoking bans for children inside cars, and they got some inspiration for their own research by listening to a radio program. So that's a really interesting observation there. That with this creativity and always questioning the how and why, I think what's true as well, Andy. Once you start thinking realist, it's very hard not to think realist.
Absolutely.
And everything that you see in the world, you're constantly saying, okay, so how and why is this happening? What are the different explanations? And that becomes quite fascinating. I think it's always useful, particularly for new researchers, early career researchers, PhD students who may be starting their journey of CMO configuration, to listen to an example. And there has been plenty of CMOs that you've done in your time, I'm sure, Andy. So I'd love to hear around your process, maybe of one of them, and walking us through a moment in your own research where you build a CMO to help you unlock a complex issue or some idea. So, what was your process and what did that look like? What was that C? What was that M? What was that O?
Yeah. So I think to answer this, I'm gonna rewind at the best part of a decade, and I'll draw on one from my own PhD. So for context, I was looking at a telephone information advice service that provided support to older people who were in the process of reassessing their housing situation and how suitable it was for their changing needs as they were getting older. So they would ring up this service, discuss their issue and be sent a generic information pack in the post. So a lot of fact sheets, typically about sheltered or extra care housing. And invariably, the program was based on this kind of consumerist and economic approach to behavior that assumed generic information is all that's needed to give people the tools they needed to become informed and act on that information. That wasn't a formal sort of initial program theory as such, but I think it's useful for me to say to get across what they thought was happening within the program. But in reality, people desired a much more relational and communicative form of support. They wanted to critically learn about their options. You could almost think about it in a more kind of pedagogic way that underpins sort of theories of learning. Why? Because the program didn't critically consider the overarching conditions in the market that provides alternative types of housing for older people, where any kind of support, information, or even the provision itself is incredibly lacking in transparency for a few reasons, but I think on account of the overall shortage of alternatives. So there's almost little to no incentive for people in that space to be transparent and supportive because demand outstrips supply. So they would always fill their places. So why waste resources of supporting people to become informed, if you like? So folk that came to the service were very much in the dark. Even when they came to the program, they initially were very happy that that anybody had picked up the phone and sent them something in the post. But they had such a low level of knowledge and awareness of how they could act that simple generic information was just not enough to give them the tools they needed to become more informed and act on that information. There was also a couple of other things going on. So there was this little subplot going on, in as much as that the key funder of the service at the time had given them a target as a condition of funding, basically where they were required to impart information to a very, very large number of clients on an annual basis. And basically, this target only made it possible to impact some generic information after a very short phone call, sometimes lasting only 2 to 3 minutes. So essentially, the service offering was constrained by targets that meant only a kind of watered down offering was possible. And it didn't give them the scope or ability to have lengthy conversations with people to help them learn about alternatives, how alternatives might be suitable for them or not, and which ones would be more accessible given the shortage of options. And almost all participants in the study said how much they desired this type of support. And some of them actively went out to get it independently of the service. I wrote this up as a findings paper at the time, and also wrote up a theoretical paper that highlights the differences in this kind of economic and consumerist approach to behavior versus a more kind of communicative, pedagogical approach to support, if you like. And whilst that summarizes pretty much all of the CMOs in a way, there were lots of little kind of nuances and things going on. For example, I'll always remember this one participant who lived on her own, had no family or adult children, and really minimal networks. and therefore had little means of engaging in the considerable deliberation that she wanted to be involved with, really, to unpick her issue, learn about how she could move on with her life. But upon receiving the information and advice in the post, she actually gave it away to someone in the hope that would trigger an in-depth conversation about the broader issue, really highlighting what she really desired. And it wasn't, a generic information pack. In her individual context, she reasoned that to get more discussion and unpick this issue, that she could do that by sort of gifting it to someone else. And that person would hopefully respond in a way that would kick off or trigger a conversation about her housing issue. And I think she said something like, you can't just take, you have to give as well. And that one's always kind of struck with me as, I suppose, illustrating a sort of level of nuance that spoke to I suppose, the wider issues that I was trying to explain beforehand. Yeah, it's always stuck with me, that one.
Thank you so much, Andy, for going into those details. And I hope as you were digging back into your PhD, you had some nice memories as well. But also, one challenge that individuals have sometimes is that they feel that this formula that is sometimes referred to, although I like your proposition of way of thinking or heuristic instead, that it has to be to the T, and we can't really deviate from that. But we know that the CMO configuration over the years has evolved. We have ICMOs now as well, where individuals have added intervention and actors, for example. You mentioned Sonia's work and the separation of mechanism into resources and responses. So I guess the question is, how flexible should we be with the format, and can CMO configurations evolve, and how should we really be using them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I always sort of I think there's a danger sometimes that I think absolutely we should think about it flexibly. But I think about this a lot, and I always come back to the same point really. And that's that one of the CMO configuration's greatest strengths is that it's, some might say, a relatively kind of simple formula. Um, So it doesn't necessarily follow, and it absolutely shouldn't follow, that it's used in a kind of way that's too linear or formulaic. On the contrary, I think it does make you think deeply and critically about what program efficacy is dependent on. The realist work in the CMO configuration is not about fitting findings into a rigid template. It's about explanatory power, isn't it? I think so. To some extent, it is fluid and flexible. But CMOs, I think, should evolve as your understanding deepens. Sometimes it makes sense to isolate a mechanism to understand it better. Other times you need to sort of zoom out and see how multiple CMOs interconnect or interact with one another, perhaps. Presenting them as narratives, which I really like doing, so I think that brings them to life. Diagrams or layered explanations can really help communicate complexity better than forcing everything into a sort of neat three-part formula. And I think generally, research shouldn't be fixed on terminology for too long. We work in fields and societies that are in flux, right? So, and not to sound too realist, but what works for some doesn't work for others. I know I said Sonia, fantastic paper in breaking up and highlighting different parts of the mechanism, which I think is really valuable. I've seen some value I've seen described recently as MCC, so mechanism, context, and change. And I quite like the idea of thinking about outcomes as change. So it gets across that, I suppose, the fact that we can think of outcomes more broadly, and I think, or more loosely rather. And I think change can be quite a nice way of thinking about that as well. Some people have criticised the CMO configuration for being too linear, too formulaic, too straightforward to capture complexity. But I think that's entirely dependent on how it's used. You know, so it doesn't have to be linear or formulaic. And I think it's the thing that some people regard as of its sort of greatest weakness is also its greatest strength in a way. It is quite simple or simplistic, but that means it can be widely used and operationalized much more straightforward.
But I guess what's useful as well as we have this conversation is that the CMO can also be, it's not context dependent, so you can use it in health, in education, in all sorts of areas, right? So I think that for when it comes to an idea that is transferable across research, I find that quite useful as well from my perspective.
Absolutely. I think, the context in which no pun intended, the context in which I used my in my PhD, for example, is quite often different to some of the students I've now ended up supervising. So I've come to the realization, I think, that how the CMO is used as well, I think, can depend heavily on the field it's being used in. So I think there are some fields, for example, where that I suppose lend themselves in a more straightforward way to realist work and that way of thinking. And I would put mental health research in that bracket. You know, mental health research is a field where there's a lot of focus on program efficacy, but not just program efficacy, but how people cognitively respond to things, right? And that some of those things are really, really enlightening for thinking about mechanisms, depending on the focus of the project. Whereas there are some fields where, let's say, the focus of the subject is less. It's almost like a lot of mental health research has been done with realism in mind, even though I'm sure that's not the case. But with other fields, that doesn't come across as much. But that's where, like, I think a lot of retroductive reasoning can come in to help kind of advance things as well.
Andy, as we wrap up our conversation today, which I think has been really useful to have into a discussion around this such central topic in realist work, which are CMOs, and would be just in a very short couple of sentences, what would you say are the top tips that you would say to someone practically when they leave this podcast, so they can start either learning about CMOs, doing CMOs, or getting better at CMO configurations?
Yeah, I think the original Orson and Tilly textbook from 1997, realistic evaluation, is still a fantastic resource for people just coming to this subject. It's written in such a brilliant way, an engaging way that's so informative and enlightening. Yeah, I can't sort of help but see beyond that. Really, it's such a it's nearly 30 years old now, but it's still a brilliant textbook. And I know there's been lots of excellent textbooks written since as well that are also really helpful, but I always sort of go back to the original text and recommend that others do.
Yeah, Andy, I think that that's a really good starting point for anyone about realist work holistically, but also with specific reference to CMOs. And on that note, and on what hopefully has been a really useful conversation for listeners, we will wrap it up just for today. More importantly, Andy, thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing to have you, to hear from you and your perspective as a researcher and a supervisor as well from students. I think that's very important for very people listening today. And I'm sure I'll speak to you soon. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Alejandro.